Welcome to everyone joining. I'll wait a bit before I start speaking just to make sure that people have time to join. Okay, great. Welcome everyone to the Oxford Forum for Questioning Extremism's first event of Michaelmas term. So we're inaugurating the term with a discussion on Afghanistan, the past and future of a war-torn society. With regards to timing for this event, the panel discussion will last approximately 40 minutes, but there will be 20 more minutes at the end for the audience to ask any questions that you all may have. So you'll be able to ask these questions directly to our panelists by raising your hand on Zoom and then unmuting when you want to speak. In this discussion, we'll be covering mainly the elements in Afghanistan's history which have led up to the Taliban's recent coup, establishing themselves as the country's leaders for the first time. And we'll also hear the panelists' thoughts on the current situation in Afghanistan and what life is like for both the civilians still living there and those who were evacuated to the United States and to Europe. And also their thoughts on what the future holds. And I now have the pleasure of introducing you all to our panelists for today, who we are so honored to host. Firstly, we have Professor Michael Clarke, who is a fellow of King's College London, the University of Aberystwyth, and the Royal College of Defence Studies. He is also the former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, which is the world's oldest defence and security think tank. From 1997 to 2019, he was a specialist advisor to the House of Commons Defence Committee and is the current specialist advisor to the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy. And his renowned publications include The Challenge of Defending Britain and Britain's Persuaders, Soft Power in a Hard World. Then we have Arash Azizzada, who is a California-based activist of Afghan descent. He's the co-founder of the non-profit organization Afghan Diaspora for Equality and Progress, which focuses on working towards social justice for Afghan-Americans and other marginalized communities in the United States. It achieves this aim through many initiatives, such as training young Afghan-Americans and making voting more accessible for Afghan immigrants by campaigning for California ballot initiatives to be displayed in Dari, Pashto, and in plain English. He is also the co-launcher of the campaign Afghans for a Better Tomorrow and has campaigned for the facilitation of refugee evacuation. Finally, Trevor Chartier has 20 years of career experience in the US Army with 4 deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, working as a military intelligence and infantry officer and retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He is currently a Department of Defense contractor. So before we start, I'd like to thank the 3 panelists for participating in the event and give them all an opportunity to briefly explain their work and experience, starting with Michael.
I look at this in my work from the point of view of the United Kingdom. I specialise in British defence policy and Western strategy, NATO policy, and so on. So I've been following Afghanistan as an operation since 2001, but took some interest in it before that. And my main sort of take on Afghanistan is from a strategic perspective. I was there on and off, never with the military, always as a civilian, but in Kandahar and Herat and Kabul and Helmand, and saw the operation changing during the visits that I made. But it was only visits. I have far less experience than our other 2 panelists in it. But it is one of the great tragedies of our era, as we thought it might be. It didn't have to go that way. It could have worked out differently until relatively late on, but it is now one of the great tragedies for the Western world in the 21st century, strategically, but even more for the people of Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. And then Arash.
Yeah, I'm here on this panel today and wanted to thank you for hosting and being quite honored to be with these esteemed panelists. But, the way we approach it, I'm a community organizer and we are feeling this in a very visceral way. And our community is mobilized is directly impacted, and we're seeing a scale of mobilization and activation an activism within our community that we haven't seen. And this is the biggest crisis moment for our community in 20 years. And so the way I think we approach it is, this is an institutional failure that we saw, and it didn't have to happen this way. Professor Clarke makes a good point there. I would say, it's because the governments and institutions that were supposed to fail us, or that were supposed to serve us, are failing us in this moment. And we can expand on that as we move along in the discussion, but we can start it off there.
Thank you. And lastly, Trevor.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. And likewise, I'm very honored to be a part of this panel. I've been looking at Afghanistan for the past 20 years. Really, the entire war has been part of my military career since the very start. So I've served a lot of time on the ground there, both at the tactical level, but also as a strategic intelligence officer. I focused on the Afghan portfolio from a strategic level, the implications with Pakistan, with China, regional, and really the strategic portion of this that I think is going to be in the future. One of the most critical aspects that we look at is how does Afghanistan join the other nations? How do we not keep them isolated, or a place that extremism can stay and grow? And I think from looking at it in my perspective, I'm actually slightly optimistic in the future if Afghanistan can start to look at how they play a role in the region, how they can start to include some of the ethnicities that have been marginalized in the past, and how they can form linkages outside the country itself, and really transform themselves into what was an isolated place before that was on the road to everywhere, but now as a landlocked country with nothing but resources, but not a lot of ways to move them out, and not a lot of ties to the rest of the world. How do they bring themselves back out into the future as a rising, really a rising cultural capital, and a way that they can participate with the rest of the nations in the region?
Great. Now, to start with some questions, often while speaking to people about the current events in Afghanistan, they are either unfamiliar with or maybe want to know more about the history of Afghanistan that led up to the current situation. So as a country, at least in the 20th century, it's often labeled as perhaps perpetually war-torn, yet the years between its independence and the several military coups in the 1970s are perhaps less violent, at least in terms of international involvement. So would you like to begin, Michael, by briefly explaining the most important points of Afghanistan's development as an independent country from 1921 until foreign involvement by the Soviet Union?
How long have you got?
Yeah, no, I was thinking that too.
No. Well, I mean, just the headline. It was always a poor country in terms of other states in the world, but it wasn't. It was not so unstable, but in the sense that it was a country that accepted its multi-ethnicity and its diversity, and there was a sort of peculiarly Afghan way of doing things. And the big change only came in the 1970s because there was a monarchy in Afghanistan, and in some ways, the late 60s, early 70s were the almost boom years in relative terms. Things were going reasonably well. And for instance, the Kajaki Dam was built in those years with American money and American aid. And if you speak to a lot of very retired Americans now who were involved in Afghanistan in those years, they speak very interestingly about it. And it was a sort of focus of American-Russian competition, but relatively peaceful competition. The change came when there was a coup by the king's brother, who then turned it into a communist state, or allied with communism, was completely incompetent, and brought the government to such a sort of a point where the Russians felt they weren't conquering Afghanistan as such. They felt they had no alternative in 1979 but to move in and sort it out. And that's when it begins. Well, when people say, Afghanistan's always been at war, it hasn't. It started, the present lamentable history of Afghanistan for the last 50 years, started with a royal coup and moved through a period of failed, nominally communist administration, followed by Russian intervention. And out of that, you get the growth of the Mujahideen, financed and led through Pakistan by the CIA, and the Mujahideen then created the basis for what became Al-Qaeda and some of the more radical groups, and the thing has escalated from there. So, I mean, those would be my headlines on it.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very helpful to know for people who perhaps didn't know as much. Next for Arash. So in your activism, you often highlight the devaluing of Afghan lives, which is often viewed as both attributable to and intersecting with UK and US foreign policy over the past 40 years. So can you explain how these intersect a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, from a 10,000 mile point of view, the way we approach it is you cannot really change policy, foreign policy of neighboring countries, but specifically of the countries that we reside in the West, here in the United States, if the lives of Black and brown people overseas, in the way the US, for example, interacts with foreign countries and foreign bodies, institutions, but specifically when it comes to Afghanistan, interaction with the Afghan people. And if we go back and look back at the past 20 years and actually go back and look at the past 40, 50 years, the past 20 years, we've seen just this emphasis when there's discussions about Afghanistan, for example. Often these panels do not include Afghan voices or impacted communities in the first place. When people speak of Afghanistan, they talk about national security and the national interest. But what that directly is saying is saying that the lives of the Afghan people are secondary, or not prioritized, or not important in the first place. And my parents are a product of displacement, and so am I. Both my parents are refugees. But that was in the context not just of the Soviet invasion, but it was the Cold War, the foreign policy of the Soviet Union, the USSR, but also the United Kingdom, and policies of the Central Intelligence Agency and United States Congress. There's a direct link to be made with the devaluing of Afghan lives and the way that intersects with foreign policy. And I think what we saw, for example, in August is like the end result of one chapter of that, the end chapter of the past 20 years specifically. And so when you see this visceral scene and image of people at the airport, of young Afghan men clinging on desperately to military cargo planes because they feel that the sky is safer than being on the ground, specifically in Afghanistan, I think that paints like a very vivid picture of what it looks like when Afghan lives are not valued. And like my work is to try to advocate for Afghan people, but to change that. And so that's why we put such a heavy emphasis on that.
Thank you very much. So one factor which contributed over history to a bit of civil unrest in Afghanistan is perhaps the fact that it is made up of many tribes of varying ethnicities, such as Pashtun, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, and more, which historically controlled their own groups, but are now living within a country with a seemingly arbitrarily drawn border and controlled by its authorities. Trevor, may you please explain this situation in more detail and how this has contributed to some historical developments in Afghanistan?
I think that the previous two answers actually really helped to set this up for an understanding of how this goes. When you look back to the policies during the Great Game, the formation of the Duran Line, those kind of baseline policies of how foreign policy for other countries was working in the area, there wasn't a whole lot of thought to Afghan lives. Even if you went back as far as Alexander the Great, it's really looking at we're on a transport to somewhere else. We have to try to control this area. We have to have some type of influence in this area, more so than really being there for the betterment of the populace. And I think that is something that continued in a lot of countries' policies. It was much more important for many to oust the Taliban than it was necessarily for us to be there to help the Afghan people. That was really kind of a side piece as part of the nation building. What we have seen quite a bit, and it's spiked over the last approximately 10 years, is kind of a reversion back to the third Afghan war. So if you looked at the time between the Soviet Union and the entrance of the United States and Great Britain into Afghanistan, you had this time of a lot of tension and a lot of tribal politics going on. Most of it was ethnic based. Some of it is tied to religion, but I wouldn't necessarily like to say that the religious differences between Shia and Sunni are more important than the tribal differences, let's say, between the Pashtuns and the Hazara. throughout the region. So as you see these minorities that are slightly oppressed, that's kind of what led to that long-standing point of the Afghan war, where you had groups like Hezbi Islami Gulbuddin in the north. You had the formation of the United Front, which most people know as the Northern Alliance, and you had these major power actors that were acting as warlords, mainly on a tribal basis, in this kind of continual and perpetual conflict that nobody was gaining an upper hand on. And honestly, for most of the Pashtuns I've spoken with during that time, they really didn't want to control much more than the Pashtun areas. People were fairly happy with the areas they had, and the conflict regions ran along those kind of splits in those borders. I think there are a lot of people who are concerned that we could very quickly revert to this state if things are not controlled or there's not some outreach. And I would like to throw it over to some of the other panelists, but I've seen quite a bit of promising pieces where former members of the Afghan government from the last 10 to 15 years have been directly involved with talks with the Taliban. There's some different movements with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar having talks with them. So there is some reaching across these divides that may lead to something better in the future as a more united state in Afghanistan. But for me, it's always really looked like Afghanistan as we know it in the US or UK is not how Afghan people view Afghanistan. Yeah. Please, and I'll hand it over to Mike here.
No, Trevor, finish your point. I just want to come in on the end of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely say that for most of the individuals I talk to, especially Pashtuns, they don't recognize the Durand line. They view themselves as this is our area that we've always been in. They don't have an interest in national level politics. They have an interest in doing things a very traditional way that they've always done.
Yeah. I mean, I was just going to make the point off the back of what Trevor said that we always make the mistake in the West, always have, of assuming that Afghanistan has the same sort of state institutions as everyone else. Well, in theory, it has had, but in practice, it's always been one of those states that is only a unified state in a very superficial level, and it usually doesn't penetrate very much. I mean, Lebanon was very like that, and Lebanon used to be a very successful example of that, where it was able to keep different communities, as it were, in the same fiction that they all lived in a state called Lebanon, but actually they didn't pay that much attention to Lebanon as a state. They didn't feel that much loyalty to it. And there is a tension here because, I mean, what Trevor says is absolutely right. It's entirely plausible that Afghanistan will start to, as it were, fracture into its natural tribal units, because in a way that there's there's Herat up in the west, there is a sort of Kabul, Kandahar access, but Kandahar is the center of the Pashtun heartlands, which extend way into the Northwest Territory, into the tribal areas of Pakistan. And it is possible that a sort of happier future for Afghan society might be a future that is a bit more flexible and is a bit more disaggregated. The interesting paradox is that is not what the Taliban want. In the 90s, when they were in control after 1996, they tried to unify the country by force. And because they want an Islamic state, they want a unified country according to what they say, for religious reasons. If they were only political analysts, they might actually settle for the sort of Afghanistan that existed in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. But they won't settle for that because they have actually a rather totalitarian vision vision what an Islamic society should really be. I think that's an interesting sort of a contradiction. They could have a viable Afghanistan if they allowed it to be a lot more flexible, but I don't think they will.
That's very interesting to hear, and also interesting that you mentioned the Northern Alliance, Trevor. So it's great to hear that the kind of liaising between several groups could lead to a better future. But to turn back to the past a bit, the Northern Alliance and its former leader Massoud, who resisted the Taliban, and meant that the Panjshir Valley in the northeast of Afghanistan remained out of Taliban hands, is now considered a hero. But he was not openly supported by foreign powers initially. So do you believe, Michael, that the US should have supported Ahmad Shah Massoud and the Northern Alliance before, and would this have led to much of a difference in the outcome?
You mean the outcome recently?
Yeah, I mean, the outcome recently, and also what happened with the Taliban getting control in general.
Well, it was never going to, the Panjshir Valley was never going to run like a rerun of the 96-2001 period, I think for all sorts of other reasons. And, you know, there are an awful lot of, 250,000, 250,000 people living in the Panjshir Valley who, you know, whose lives matter and who do not want to see the valley become yet again the sort of center of an Afghan civil war. I think there was never any realistic chance that the West was going to help Massoud and, you know, the son of the great lion of the Panjshir, the way they wanted to help the lion of the Panjshir, mainly because the West is on its way out of Afghanistan. They didn't want to create the beginnings of another involvement by leaving behind, as it were, a commitment to get involved in a civil war. So that was never the possibility. I mean, if the Taliban cannot hold on to Afghanistan in a security sense, in a sense of using force where they think they will, then the Panjshir is probably where their grip will slip first. But we'll have to see. I mean, the situation is so chaotic, and the winter that Afghanistan faces is so bad. In the sense that, you know, if you look at the news, you see people on scooters up and down the main streets in Kabul. It looks kind of normal in its way, but the underlying economy is just gone. It's just collapsed, and it looks as if Afghanistan is facing a winter of real, you know, possible starvation, of real poverty, of real collapse. And the way in which that plays through to the Taliban, and the way in which the Taliban try to find out what it's like to govern a country of 40 million people. It's not a small country, it's a big country with a lot of people who are very inventive, very good at what they do. That's not an easy thing for anyone to sort out, let alone a group that has only ever been concerned with guerrilla warfare and has only got a rather tenuous hold on what government really is.
Thank you very much for that. After the Taliban takeover, how do you think that this will affect the countries around Afghanistan? So first of all, Pakistan as a neighbor, and in some areas, a Taliban stronghold will surely be affected. But what about, for example, Iraq? Maybe Trevor could answer this one.
So I think they're definitely two separate questions in there that you're looking at. The first, the immediate neighbors. In all honesty, Pakistan has had quite a bit to gain by maintaining some level of instability in Afghanistan and in the region. A lot of what they've done with the Pakistani ISI and the way they've supported certain things while supporting the Taliban has also kind of looked at regional instability in the area, and they do have some interest in what's playing out there. The other unknown factor that's going to really come to a head probably within the next 18 months is how China looks at Afghanistan for natural resources, and how they are going to look at exerting the mineral rights that they've already purchased, and what that looks like with the new government. So it'll be very interesting to see how that works in the future. If you look at the situation going on in Iraq and how Iran has viewed everything in the region over the past 20 years, kind of being surrounded by US and NATO conflict on both sides of them has led them to reach out in unconventional ways to exert their influence throughout the region, whether it's through what they're using in Lebanon, through the Yemen conflict. There's a number of different ways that Iran has kind of tried to keep a regional power while not having neighbors who they can easily cooperate with. I think this will be very interesting to see as Iraq starts to settle down. If, you know, not to get too off the subject of Afghanistan, but if Iraq does start to see some level of Sunni cooperation in the government, some bringing back, and Iranian influence starts to wane a little bit, it'll be interesting to see how they flex into Afghanistan, or what parts they might look to exert influence in. There definitely is some tension in different parts. There's a lot of suspicion of Iranians in some of the areas I've been in Afghanistan. specifically in the Hazara region, being Shia and having that kind of religious connection at least. They're usually worried about some type of Iranian influence or some type of espionage occurring in those areas. So it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out, both with those neighbors and then across the Arabian Peninsula in general. How different Arab neighbors support them or look at them as a possible trading partner, or if they're going to kind of keep them at arm's length. And I think US and UK policy is going to do a lot to kind of shape how they look in the future as to which partners they might have reach out, whether it be Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or other partners in the area to do business with them in the future.
On that topic, you mentioned what the US and UK can do and how they will be involved. Arash, how do you believe that other countries can help those still residing in Afghanistan, but most notably without pushing more of an imperialist agenda?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. You know, we're talking about some of the failures of Western countries, neighboring countries. Pakistan has had this like long approach towards Afghanistan, saying that you know, they were essentially telling the United States, "Hey, we know that you'll one day leave, and so we're going to exert our influence." And I think it plays out in a variety of different ways for Afghans, because Afghans are now in country in Afghanistan. They're also in third countries and neighboring countries. So it becomes a refugee question and a refugee policy. But I think the United States and the UK and the European Union and neighboring countries can play a constructive role, because where Afghanistan finds itself now is on the brink. It's actually in a humanitarian crisis. The UN report said that roughly 97% of the Afghan population will plunge into mid-poverty by mid-2023. There's a liquidity crisis. Of financial sector is in free fall and collapsing. And so there will be a dire need by countries to play a constructive role, whether that's the unfreezing of assets and to some degree, or sending humanitarian aid and establishment of a humanitarian corridor. I think that's where the moral and political obligation lies for countries like the United States to ensure that Afghans simply do not starve, because that's where we find ourselves at. There was this dependency on foreign aid that was built over the past 20 years. What's one of the major failures of what's occurred. There was this faucet that was just on for 20 years, where billions of dollars went to Afghanistan, and tons of it went to many Afghan elites, unfortunately, who enriched themselves. But there was at least a flow into the country, but it was heavily reliant on Western aid. And now that faucet's been turned off, and we are seeing, unfortunately, the result of that. And it's the Afghan people who are kind of on the front lines who are facing the consequences of that. So that's where I think the obligation lies for you know, not just for the neighboring countries in the United States, but also other countries like Japan, who have more neutral roles in terms of participation in previous years in military conflict where they were not involved, for example.
Thank you very much. So, Michael, Pakistan and China are nominally allies. I mean, Trevor mentioned China briefly, I think, but many, I think this is an interesting topic to look at. Many think that China is using its sort of location to gain dominance, or Pakistan's location, I mean, while providing it with very large loans, just of the type that Arash was just mentioning. So do you think that China will be able to, or want to, increase its domination over Asia further in the wake of the Taliban takeover?
I think the first thing to say is a caveat that the Chinese will be careful how they operate in Afghanistan and what they do, because they won't want to just rush in. They don't want another to get into another North Korea scenario where they are propping up a government that's become a hermit kingdom. So there's a caveat there, but the fact is that China has all the choices in this, in the way that the Western world only has minor choices left, as Trevor was saying, over aid and sanctions and lifting restrictions on capital and over recognition. Those are relatively small levers that the West can try to manipulate. but China has all of the big choices. So does Pakistan in a way. And so as usual, one of the great ironies of 20 years of Western operations in Afghanistan is that China is the strategic winner, just as the strategic winner from the Iraq war of 2003 to 2011 was Iran. And so, as it were, the West's adversaries, America's adversaries, have become the two biggest winners from America's two biggest operations in the last 20 years. Now, that's not all bad news for the world, because China, like most of the neighbors, has an interest in stability in Afghanistan, but it wants to pursue, first of all, it wants resources, and Afghanistan has got lots of resources, but they are not cheap to get out, but it's got great resources of a lot of things, a lot of precious metals, a lot of lithium, very important for modern batteries. It has silver, it has diamonds, and it has ores, certain ores, which are also quite important. So China will be very interested in that. More than that, they'll be interested in the Belt and Road Initiative, because this great Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, Afghanistan offers, as it were, a territory with Afghanistan and Pakistan within Chinese influence, if that's how it develops. That gives them a very clear motive to create a great sort of strategic highway from Kashgar in Xinjiang province, right up on the border of Xinjiang, right through to Gwadar, the port in Pakistan, which the Chinese effectively are building. And that route, that is probably the most strategically important route, potentially, of the whole Belt and Road Initiative. And a motorway from Peshawar to Kabul, for instance, would turn out to be a very important link. So you can see that there's obvious motives for China in developing this, but it won't be foolish. It will do it in a rather measured way. And that may be a thing for the West to work on, as it were, that we've lost influence in that part of the world. Pakistan is a different issue. But as far as China goes, it's in our interest to try to, if possible, work with China to help its influence in Afghanistan to be moderate and stabilizing in different ways. One final point I'd make, which we haven't mentioned yet, is that Russia is a gainer from this as well, not directly in Afghanistan, but because the West's defeat in Afghanistan represents American withdrawal of interest from Central Asia. This actually is an opportunity for President Putin to reconnect in some of the territories he was losing influence in, like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and Tajikistan, and indeed even in Kazakhstan. So the stands of Central Asia are a lot more skeptical about the West and the United States now, and that is a political gain for President Putin, which he is very alive to.
Thank you very much. And it's been really beneficial and insightful to look into kind of some foreign policy and foreign international relation areas. But I think looking at society, how society in Afghanistan will look under the Taliban is another really important point. Arash, Afghanistan is currently one of the worst, if not the worst country in the world when it comes to gender equality, which is a view held by many, but often perpetuating the narrative that the Western world ought to intervene in this to save the Afghan woman can be viewed as harmful to those very women. What do you think can actually be done to improve gender equality in Afghanistan, or is this an issue which the US and Europe should admit their past failings in and not try to intervene with?
Yeah, I think we find ourselves at this complicated intersection and conjecture of Afghan history, because frankly, what has happened in these past few weeks is that the rights of women in Afghanistan have been decimated pretty much overnight, while also acknowledging that the history of the phrase, to save Afghan women has been very deeply problematic and has actually been used to justify an imperialist agenda and occupation. And the story of the past 20 years specifically, I've been involved in advocacy for women for the past 3 years, specifically to get them at the negotiating table at Doha, which we didn't succeed in. But we kept discussing the gains and the rights that were made over the past 20 years. But there's a complicated history there, and there is no dominant narrative of Afghan women's gains and rights that have been made in Afghanistan. If you were to live in Kabul or Herat or in one of the major cities, your story differs than if you were to be a Shia Hazara woman in Bamyan, which is a rural area, or if you were a Pashtun woman in rural Helmand province, which is in the south. Do they all have different stories and different narratives to tell about how the occupation, for example, or how many gains and rights they've made, if there were any gains at all for them or their families from Western intervention? And I think, you know, we also find ourselves at this point where we are, in our advocacy now, we are asking, demanding that the world does not recognize the Taliban, which they haven't done so, including Pakistan, which is notable because they were one of 3 countries that in the 90s did recognize the Taliban. Because there's leverage points, you know, there's power dynamics at play. Because, for example, if there's an effort where we can ensure that women can go back to school, which they can't in this very moment, the Taliban have put that on hold. If there is an effort to be made for women to be allowed to enter their civil society again and to go back to their public sector jobs, which they held earlier this summer, what do we do? What does the West do then? But I think, for example, there's like really simple and efficient ways of pressuring the Taliban. You know, the UN Women's Agency sent a delegation to Kabul. They sent a man, you know, and foreign dignitaries and I think foreign embassies were also meeting with the Taliban about 2 weeks ago. They were all men again. So there's like really simple ways to kind of put pressure because the Taliban is looking at, the Taliban has been mimicking diplomacy and diplomatic relations. It's not really participating in them because it doesn't know how to. It strives for international recognition without actually doing the work. You know, if they were deeply interested in being recognized by the West or even Pakistan, they would not do some of the things. They would form an interim government with women and ethnic minorities, and they would be truly inclusive, which they haven't been doing. So I mean, for the West, they can at least start with sending women as part of their delegations, because that's just that is not something that the Taliban welcomes, and that is not something they can show off to the world. What they can show off is when the UN or Western embassies send an all-men delegation to meet with the Taliban. So there's like really simple, constructive ways to engage with the Taliban that does not make them look good. That should be the bare minimum here. And unfortunately, it's been quite disappointing to see these all-male delegations that have been sent to meet with the Taliban.
Just a quick note on that. A couple of weeks ago, Britain actually sent somebody to speak directly with the Taliban, Sir Simon Gass, who is the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee in the cabinet. They didn't send an ambassador, they didn't send a minister, they sent an intelligence chief on the assumption that, of course, that's he will be taken seriously by the Taliban, and his job was to go there for a couple of days and give them some very hard messages, which effectively, and I'm guessing now because I don't know what he said, but I'm pretty sure I can estimate that he will have said to them, you know, if you guys want to be taken seriously in the outside world, if you want to actually get the recognition and then the help that you obviously need, then you've got to begin to do things. And here is a list of things which you should try to do. They've tried to give them hard messages. Whether that they're getting through is another question. And whether, and again, I mean, Arash and Trevor would know this better than me, whether the Taliban is a sufficiently unified group at the moment to be able to speak for itself logically is an open question. There's so much disunity within Taliban ranks that it's not clear that even if the Taliban took a policy decision, they could actually deliver it. I hope they could, but I'm not sure.
Thank you very much for that perspective. Now, talking of the Taliban and their previous instances of rule, how similar do you think this period of Taliban governmental rule will be to other instances where the Taliban have previously held power, albeit not centralized, but in slightly smaller, on a slightly smaller scale, Trevor?
I think tying the two previous points together into this is kind of important to fully understand what might be possible. The Taliban, being a primarily Pashtun organization, still has those tenets of Pashtun-Wali, of which their treatment of women is one of their primary concerns. From their personal view, the way women are treated is with a severe amount of respect, and it is their duty to protect women in a very certain way. Now, that is from their view. As from the West view, that it's kind of backwards and it is something that women should be able to fend for themselves. These are almost at odds with some of the basic tenets of the Pashtun and how they should be as men. And that's something we've seen quite a few times. And when the Taliban have full control, which I don't know if they will anytime soon, I would expect to see a lot of those tenets be really formalized in the way that they go about business. While there has been that acceptance of we should be a constitutional government, there is still going to be these underlying themes that we've seen that allow for the mistreatment of women, for the marginalization of women, and the loss of women's rights. In the future, as Afghanistan, as the West really comes and has these hardline approaches of what they need to do to be able to come out and be a participant, China is able to act as that actor, not really caring how things go on in their country, but as they do set up the Belt and Road, as you're looking almost at an economic NATO, if you will, run by China in a way that can leverage a lot of economic power throughout the region. As a strategic partner, the Taliban will not have to give up any of the ways that they believe. They do not have to really come to the ways of the West. As long as they are willing to do some of the projects that China asked for, as long as they're willing to kind of go along, most of which are for major infrastructure projects that China offers in these Belt and Road initiatives that are really great boost for the host country economies and for their local, even down to the local level for jobs programs. There's, we have the possibility that we're going to lose a lot of our levers to see how individual citizens are treated, especially women in Afghanistan. You have to remember, over the last 20 years, with the billions of dollars that we put in, we built one highway and it goes in a circle. There's no roads going out. We got one ring road in the middle, Highway 1, and we haven't really given Afghanistan the tools to reach out economically, where China has the ability to do that, with none of the concessions needing to be made for any of the social or human rights portions of that interaction.
One further point about the future of Afghanistan and what we can do in the future. With regards to taking in refugees, often, Arash, you and the organization you founded, Afghan Diaspora for Equality and Progress, campaign for the removal of the humanitarian parole application fee, which is currently, I think, $775 per person for any person, even a child. So how prohibitive has this been for Afghans who want to enter the US? And in the future, do you see the Biden administration waiving this?
All excellent questions, I think. Yeah, I mean, the context for this being my father left Afghanistan in 1980. My mother left in 1984, and they went. My mother went through Pakistan, then France, and eventually settled in the Netherlands, where I was born. My father went directly to the Netherlands. Early 1980s, they lived in a world where the political climate was not as hostile to refugees as it is today. Also acknowledging that it wasn't very friendly even back then, but there were opportunities and pathways to like getting some kind of entry to refuge and safety and human dignity, which my parents to some degree were able to do. Like as an Afghan, I'm considering myself one of the lucky ones. We live in a very different climate now. And I think the fact that the Biden administration evacuated as many people as it did, and we're looking at roughly 52,000 people sitting on military bases, newly arrived Afghans who will be processed to some degree and resettled within the United States, a total of like roughly 90,000 who will be in some way now living in the United States. I mean, that is nothing short of a miracle. And that's probably because Afghanistan and the US have this like deeply complicated actually relationship. we campaigned to get, for example, the humanitarian parole application fee waived, which is $575, very cost prohibitive. Members in our community are maxing out their credit cards, doing private fundraising, just throwing their savings at a possible tool. And just for folks who are not well read as immigration attorneys, which I wasn't, but I'm probably an expert now. It's $575 per person, but it's a tool to gain entry to the United States. It's not an application for asylum. It's not an application to get legal status within the United States. It's to gain entry in order to ask for asylum. And so like the immigration system in the United States, which I'm sure like Western Europe, the Western countries in Europe probably set the tone for this in the decades before. But it's a system that's designed to reject. And so now we are looking at a situation where the United States and the West were partially responsible for creating the refugees in the first place and then refused to take them in. And so that takes up a bulk of our work and advocacy and energy right now, because we are looking at folks who are desperate. And just to give people a sight into what I deal with on a daily basis, you know, like on a daily basis, I wake up and I look at my messages and I get emails from folks like yourself to be on this panel, but it's at least 10 to 20 messages a day asking for requests for evacuation from folks in Afghanistan, members of civil society, members of the LGBTQ community in Afghanistan, journalists, former government officials, and people just trying to escape Taliban repression and retribution, actually, for the prior work in these past 20 years. And, you know, for example, we've asked the administration to waive the fee because it's so cost prohibitive. It doesn't make sense. The United States Congress just passed $6.3 billion in funds allocated for this entire Afghan crisis, and for them to be resettled and for them to be processed. So there's no need to fundraise off the Afghan-American community or Afghan community in general to process them. The Biden administration has signaled not a lot of openness and willingness to hear us out. I think they want to kind of clean their hands of this issue in the first place. They tried to clean their hands of, like, the preparation in terms of withdrawal wasn't there anyway. You know, like the SIV, the backlog of SIVs and other folks who had some tool to gain entry to the United States. It was already there, but they did not seem interested, and anyone seemed to want to have their energy focused on this in the first place. I think the political calculation that is currently being made is that there's midterm elections coming up next November, where they'll be probably roundly defeated. They'll probably lose control of the Senate. They'll probably lose control of the House as well, House of Representatives. And I think they are just deadly afraid of the right-wing rhetoric against refugees and how badly that will cast the Biden administration in terms of folks who are now here. So we are not very optimistic. That being said, we're not gonna kind of let that be a final answer. Privately, they've indicated that they will not listen to any of our demands, but that doesn't mean we'll externally not put the pressure on them in the next few weeks and months. And that's kind of the road ahead for our advocacy work. We're going to continue to ramp up pressure no matter which elected officials are in power. We think Afghans deserve safety, dignity, refuge, human dignity, and the United States specifically owes that to the Afghan people.
Thank you very much, Arash. Now, one final question before I open up the floor to the attendees to ask anything they would like to our panelists. How, Trevor, do you think the best way would be to bring Afghans together in the future? Like, what could the Taliban do to enact this? Now, I know you've been speaking about the kind of tribal organization, how they've sort of been coming together and how there's been hope there. I know there's been hope for that. There was hope for that to happen before the Taliban coup. In the future, in general, how do you think this can be enacted after the Taliban coup?
The next few months, I think, will be very, very important into how the future of Afghanistan really lays out. there's a few things that the Taliban could do from the West. There's a lot that we would need to do to make sure that they are an active participant on the global stage. Hopefully in the last 20 years, some of the things that we've done, even though it was a war-torn country for 20 years, some of the infrastructure projects, some of the initiatives, some of the things that hopefully for 20 years, in some places, life was a little bit better and gave some type of view to some of the Afghan people on how things could be, how a larger engagement could be, how having partners across the world could be, and hopefully those seeds grow within the next generation, especially when it comes to women and the rights of women. I was able to meet the mayor of Nili, who was the first female mayor in Afghanistan, being in a Hazara, being very, very secured in Kundi province. It was kind of an isolated place. It was a place where an educated woman, could be whatever she wanted to be. Those kind of things, those kind of knowing that those kind of people are there, hopefully is what can plant the seeds for a continued dialogue. I think one of the poorest things we could do would be to continue to isolate, to not acknowledge their existence, to look at something and say that it is so appalling to us that we will not engage with that country at all. I think we've learned a number of different times in the hermit states across the world, or the isolated across the world, that a refusal to talk only provides a forum for the ruling party to have complete control of the rhetoric, complete control of the narrative, and a place for extremism to grow. The more the conversation is open, the more the dialogue is open, I think the better the chance is that we'll see a normalizing in the coming years. But hopefully those things will happen in a few months rather than in a generation.
Thank you for that optimistic answer. I'd now like to open up to any questions from our audience. So if you use the raise hand function on Zoom, I'll be able to unmute you and you can ask your question directly to the panelists. Otherwise, I'm happy to read anything out if people want to put things in the Q&A box. Okay, so I'll unmute our first question. Should be good.
Hi, I'm Lucy. I just want to say thank you so much to all the panelists for such an interesting talk. I have a question for Michael about UK policy. So the fact that UK policy mirrored US policy kind of quite a lot in Afghanistan, including kind of to demonstrate alliance, to me is quite interesting. Do you think that UK involvement in Afghanistan actually aided the US, or did it make any difference to the situation on the whole, or do you think that it might have undermined the UK's credibility on a worldwide stage?
Yes to most of that, actually. British policy initially was to try to help the US in 2001. We wanted to be part of it, and we were our special forces were, but not otherwise. Then that golden hour, between 2001 and 2003, effectively when things might have been much, much better, was lost because the United States turned its attention to Iraq. And so we did as well. And just when we needed to really commit to Iraq, Britain was then quite influential in re-energizing the Afghan policy in 2006 and made it a much bigger military operation, which brought to bring the United States back into Afghanistan. But I mean, I've been writing about the fact that the most strategically important decision you take is the first one. And after that, you don't have a whole lot of strategic choice if you're not the United States or China or Russia. And most of British policy in Afghanistan was actually very just tactical. We were operating in Helmand, doing a good job on the ground, doing the best that the boys and girls on the ground could. And, I was there a fefew times and I never met any of them who didn't believe they were doing something useful. But it was all tactical. Strategy was in the United States' hands, and the US working with the Kabul government or not, as the case may be. And so, Britain is now left with the situation that we played a role in the early days. In a sense, we thought we could do more strategically, but as with Iraq, both Iraq and Afghanistan, Britain had no strategically important role to play after the early stages. We were constrained, very constrained, and so the lament in Britain at the moment is it's been an awful It's been an awful defeat, a strategic defeat. It's been shameful and humiliating, but shameful in terms of we've let down all the people we made promises to. And officials turned around. I was at a meeting yesterday in which senior officials said, yes, that's all true, but what else could we do?
Thank you for that answer, and it's great to hear a British perspective for those of us who are listening from Oxford. Does anyone else have any more questions? I'll unmute someone else. There, that should work.
Good evening, Michael. My name's Thomas Cabot. I'm here from Oxford, and I'm just studying a master's at the moment. My question was, you raised the point about China earlier, and talking about how they're going to try and exert their mineral rights within the region. Could you just slightly elaborate on that and how much of a concern this is for not just the UK, but for the West, and that this is another country that China is going to try and establish a new foothold in, and what actions the West or the UK will be potentially looking to do in the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, my fellow panelists will have things to say about that, I'm sure. But in general, China is on a resource buying spree across the board on resources, all forms of energy, for reasons that we're all aware of. And still, remember, there are regular daily blackouts in the Chinese provinces because they have an energy crisis which is worse than the crisis we are anticipating here in the West. So, I don't want to monopolize this, but other than to say that China has an imperative, a real imperative, to garner resources of all sorts. And Afghanistan is full of resources, but I think, as Trevor said, they're not easily exploitable because the infrastructure isn't there. So it'd be quite a big long-term effort to insert the infrastructure. But China has the choice. It can choose to invest if it wants to, and it probably now has the time to do so, because the rest of the world is not going to try and involve itself to that degree. We're kind of out of it now, except at the political level of trying to pull levers to persuade the Taliban government to think a bit differently. I mean, I'm sure Trevor and Arash have got some thoughts on that.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree. When you look at the rare earth materials that Afghanistan has significant deposits of, that China's been trying to get their hands on, it's really going to be a boom if they decide to put in the infrastructure. There is a very large cost at the front end for China, but the gains are significant in cornering the market on a number of those materials, especially technology-based materials that China is very interested in.
Thank you for your answers there, Trevor and Michael. If anyone else has any more questions, I'd be happy, or I'm sure the panelists would be happy to take those. I've got another, I'll allow it to talk there.
Hello, I'm just curious if the US initially tried a more of a confederation type policy and nation building and took more interest in the various needs of the various different communities within Afghanistan, do you think the society would have been more successful, and not both from the strategic standpoint of guerrilla warfare, but also from the humanitarian standpoint, been more successful? Or do you think that a foreign nation coming in and imposing anything would have always led to kind of suboptimal people like Ashraf Ghani coming into power and then chaos?
So from the US perspective, I think when we started the war, and especially in the first few years, it was very much viewed as a NATO operation. So there was that view that this is, at least there are a large number of partner nations. I know for even one full year of my time in Afghanistan, I was actually working for an Australian brigade and their efforts in Tarin-Kowt in Uruzgan province. So there were different elements that I think were able to meet the needs of the local populace. A lot of our relief programs were very much aimed at a local level. I do have to say, though, for all the relief programs that were put in place, both in Afghanistan and Iraq, the the graft and corruption was significant in the way that money was funneled off to places it wasn't supposed to be. The fact that most service members who were doing the bulk of the work on the ground were trained for combat and not this type of operation also hindered us, especially in those first years, where there wasn't a lot of understanding of how to not necessarily do nation building, but how to do counterinsurgency operations to gain the trust of the public, to be out there in and with the people in a way that they understood you and there was at least some common connection, instead of whoever the adversary, or people would say they're insurgents, but they're part of the actual community that was there. Have the ability to move amongst the people, to hide amongst the people. And that's kind of what we lost at that local level in those first few years, is that understanding of being able to get out there and, really at the smallest level, make ourselves seen in a way that was not antagonistic. I think there will be continued difficulties going forward in the understanding. Michael did an excellent job of pointing out how Afghans don't really view or understand the large construct of government. They still are extremely tribal in how things maneuver. So the Taliban being that large construct, primarily Pashtun, that was able to govern this area, didn't have that full control of the government. I think there could be something said for how we could go with a coalition in the early days. Might have helped a larger coalition, or a coalition more aimed at not necessarily nation building, but getting the Afghans back on a common footing may have been successful. But at the same time, it's a point of pride with most of the Afghans that I've met in how they have fought off foreign invaders for hundreds of years. They understand how, they know the stories going back to Alexander the Great. I've personally had numerous Afghans walk their fighting positions with me of where they fought the Soviets, and just have immense pride in how they fought off the Soviet invaders. So really already starting on that kind of back foot of, no matter what, we are the invader, and that view of just anyone who is not Afghan is not welcome here.
Thank you very much for your perspective, Trevor. And I think we're going to wrap it up here, as we have just run out of time. So I'd like to thank our fantastic panelists for your time and what has been a really, really insightful discussion. And it's been a pleasure hosting you all tonight. And I hope everyone in the audience enjoyed the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well done for organising it. Well done.
Thank you.